Welcome to Tom's True Crime. Today, we take you to Sarasota, Florida. Sarasota is a vibrant coastal city known for its stunning beaches and cultural attractions. It is a suburban-type area, family-friendly, quaint with small-town charms. It has a laid-back lifestyle with easy access to urban conveniences. On October 3, 2012, a 911 call came in just after 2 that afternoon from a mail carrier. The mail carrier tells dispatch that there's a dead man on the street. He's in his car. The mail carrier said the man looked like he probably had a heart attack. Police and EMTs rushed to the scene. Officer Gary Bowman was the first to arrive. He approached the vehicle and he realized that he knew the taxi driver. His name was Carlos. He was slumped over to the right side. 53-year-old Carlos Donati had been driving a cab in Sarasota for almost 30 years. Carlos was well known in the community, very popular. Just one of those guys that always had a smile on his face. The guy that will wave at you every morning you see him at the coffee shop, say, "Hello, how's it going?" But was the friendly, easygoing cab driver actually dead? Despite what the 911 caller reported, Officer Bowman hoped that was not the case. When Officer Bowman opened the door of the cab to check Carlos' vital signs, he touched blood on the left side of his neck. His hand was full of blood. He realizes that it was not a heart attack. It was something more. Carlos has been shot twice in the back of the head. And yet, despite the grave nature of Carlos's injuries, the original report of a dead man on the street was incorrect. EMS arrived on the scene shortly. With their equipment, they were able to detect some signs of life. With Carlos clinging desperately to life, the EMTs fought to save him. They removed him out of the vehicle and started performing CPR, attempting to resuscitate him. It was intense. Within minutes, they had hustled Carlos into the back of the ambulance and raced off to the emergency room. Carlos has a family. He has a wife. With Carlos's fate still uncertain as the ambulance raced away, the police made an urgent call to his wife, 60-year-old Karen Donati, to break the horrifying news that her husband of 10 years was fighting for his life. Born in 1952, Karen started life an hour away from Sarasota. She lived in Lakewood Ranch when she was younger. And it was there that teenage Karen fell for a neighborhood boy named Christopher. They developed a friendship. Eventually, Christopher and Karen became an item. Karen very much was in love with Christopher, but Karen had fallen for a bad boy. Christopher had gotten in a lot of trouble. He had been involved in drugs, and her teenage romance soon led her down a dangerous path. She started out with pills. From pills, she went to cocaine. She made some very poor choices. Christopher's choices soon landed him behind bars. Heartbroken by her boyfriend's incarceration, Karen did her best to start over. By her 20s, she had met someone new and appeared to be on a better path. She was married, she has 2 daughters and a son. But that relationship eventually ended. Once her kids were grown, Karen struggled with what to do for the next chapter of her life, a search that would lead her to Sarasota, Florida and Carlos Donati. 7 years younger than Karen, Carlos's life started in Newark, New Jersey. But when Carlos was only 5, the family moved after their father took a job near Sarasota. His father worked at the Sarasota VA clinic until he retired, age 79. Sarasota was the only home that Carlos ever really knew. He really wouldn't have remembered anything about New Jersey. He was 5 years old. Growing up in Sarasota, Carlos thrived in his new environment. He always had a lot of friends. Even at a young age, he would have friends coming around to the house and he would be there all the time. Carlos was easygoing, lovable, playful, and outgoing. Not long after graduating high school in 1978, he launched a career that fit with his easygoing, gregarious nature. He started his own taxi company. That's all he wanted to do, drive a taxi. It meant everything to him. He loved to be out in the public. By the end of the 90s, Carlos had built a successful business. Lawyers, doctors, everybody wanted him to be their driver, take them to the airport or wherever. The lovable cabbie had also become a fixture in his hometown. He's a guy that in community knew, nice guy. Carlos talked to everybody, the police, the mayor, anybody. However, at the age of 40, Carlos had yet to meet someone special. However, Carlos was about to become seriously involved. He met Karen at the train station. He picked her up, and as the friendly cab driver talked to her, he learned that Karen was trying to turn her life around after a long struggle with drug addiction. She had been through detox, and she was in the Y because she needed somewhere to stay. She didn't have anywhere to stay, and she has to go through that program. After that meeting, he got her number or where she lived, and he would pick her up from time to time. Then he brought her to meet the family, and it was clear that Karen was becoming more than just a regular fare. He told his family that he liked Karen. When Karen completed her program, Carlos convinced his family to help. When she came out of the Y, she had nowhere to go. Carlos' mother took her in. She stayed with his mother for about 9 months. Carlos and Karen got closer and closer, and they just started dating. Karen's recovery had given her a new lease on life, and Carlos was a big part of that. They really liked each other. They enjoyed each other's company. The couple eventually got an apartment together, and after a year of dating, Carlos asked Karen to marry him. Carlos loved her dearly. He did a lot for her and her family. Karen said yes. After all, he had rescued her when she needed it most. Karen loved Carlos because he was good to her. In 2002, they were married. It was a beautiful wedding. Carlos and his whole family did all the cooking for the wedding. Marrying Karen made Carlos an instant grandparent since her children were grown with children of their own. Karen's grandkids, every one of them loved Carlos. Karen's daughter's kids were in the car with Carlos all the time. He would bring them up to his mother's house. He loved those little kids like they were his own. Over the next few years, the couple settled into a modest but comfortable life together. Karen was working at Walmart, and he was really doing well. At that point, he had other people running for him. So his money was coming in, and he was able to take care of his taxi business. Carlos still loved to drive, though. He drove his cab regularly, and Karen was often at his side. Karen used to ride with Carlos everywhere on his runs, except when she was away visiting her daughter for the weekend or at work. He would take her to work, pick her up after work, and they ride around. They worked together all the time. However, Karen was not riding along for what turned out to be Carlos's last ride. Officer Gary Bowman traveled with Carlos Donati in the ambulance to the hospital. The EMS guys were working very hard. Immediately upon arrival to the hospital, they continue life-saving measures. They continue to perform CPR, and while the doctors were working on Carlos, his wife of 10 years, 60-year-old Karen Donati, rushed to his side. His wife has shown up within what appeared to Officer Bowman minutes of their arrival at the hospital. Unfortunately, Karen was already too late. At 3:05, they pronounced him dead. She was crying. She was visibly upset. When Carlos's family was told he had been shot, they were shocked. They could not understand why anyone would want to shoot him. He didn't bother anybody. He didn't do anything to anyone. The most logical assumption based on what police knew so far was a robbery. It would be the direction any investigator would probably begin with. So hoping to piece together Carlos's last hours, the investigators turned to the friends and family gathered in the waiting room. The family at the hospital was understandably very distraught, upset, emotional, but at the same time, they were very helpful. Detectives needed to find out who he was last with. That will give them the information that they need. And it just so happened that one of Carlos's friends had an important clue to share. A friend of Carlos's named Patricia. She often rode along with him for company. Carlos always liked somebody else to be there. So Patricia would ride because she did not have a job at the time. Patricia told the investigators that she had been riding with Carlos earlier that afternoon, and shortly before he dropped her off, Carlos had gotten a call. She said she picked up the phone. Patricia would answer his phone all the time in the car, and the man says, "I need a ride from Maple Avenue." Did the fact that the caller wanted to be picked up on the street where Carlos had been shot mean he was the killer? Back at the crime scene, there was nothing inside the cab to identify Carlos's final fare. The police did find some key evidence. There were 2 shell casings in the car and a live round left in the back seat of the car. Police were looking for a .22 caliber handgun as the murder weapon. In addition to the shell casings in the back seat, the investigators at the scene also found Carlos's empty wallet. Perhaps someone with a substance abuse problem needed to score some cash fast. That was investigators' first impression of what might have happened. If the killer was an addict looking for some quick cash, it looked like they had made a critical error. Carlos' cell phone was not in the cab, and it was not on his person. Had the killer taken it? The investigators hoped that was the case. Smartphones put off a GPS locator, and you can ping it and find out where it is. Investigators contacted the phone carrier. They were able to track that phone. They found that the cell phone was not in Sarasota. It was across the Manatee River. Investigators had a general area of where the phone was. It was somewhere along a stretch of highway not far from the river. At that point, they had a detective constantly calling the phone, and they walked through along the side of the road until they hear the phone ringing. It was located on the side of a road as if it had been thrown out of a window of a moving car. The cell phone trace did not lead the police directly to Carlos's killer, but it did provide a crucial clue. They knew the direction of travel. They knew they would have to cross the Manatee Avenue Bridge. That was important because there were video surveillance cameras on it and recorded every vehicle that went over it. The question was, whose car were they looking for? Could the call log of Carlos' phone provide an answer? Police immediately tried to figure out who the last phone call was made from. Investigators were able to trace that call to a burner phone. A prepaid or burner phone is a phone you buy, you put minutes on it. There was not a name associated with it. Desperate, the investigators contacted the burner phone's provider, and while they had no way to identify who had purchased the phone, they could provide police with a list of calls made by the burner. And when the detectives reviewed it, they realized that in addition to Carlos, the owner of the burner phone had also called a woman named Lorraine Clark. The Sarasota police, state police, and a state trooper went to Lorraine Clark's house. They showed her the phone number. Lorraine immediately identified it as being her friend Christopher Dominic. Lorraine Clark was questioned at the police station. Investigators asked Lorraine how she knew Christopher Dominic. She told investigators that she met Christopher Dominic through an associate of hers who was a resident of Florida State Prison. In other words, an inmate of Florida's maximum security state prison. Investigators found, after running a criminal history on Christopher Dominic, to be someone who had recently served time for 2 murders. He had gotten out in November of 2011. He was still on parole. For the past 11 months, he had been living with his wife. She was a minister. She went to visit him on a ministry, and she married him in prison. However, what stood out to the investigators was the fact that Christopher and his wife lived in the town of Bradenton across the Manatee River from Sarasota. When the investigators reviewed the surveillance footage from the bridge, it looked as if everything was finally falling into place. They were able to observe the vehicle, which they believed to be Christopher Dominic's, across the Manatee Avenue Bridge, approximately 1 p.m., heading toward Sarasota. The same vehicle was seen coming back across the bridge toward Bradenton at approximately 2 p.m. There seems to be a connection there. Less than 10 hours after the shooting, the Sarasota police were in Bradenton looking for some answers. A little after midnight, police knocked on the door of Christopher Dominic's residence. He was not happy to see them. Christopher agrees to go to the police department. He's interviewed by 2 detectives. As soon as Christopher sat down with the detectives, they realized the ex-con would be tough to crack. He gave off an aura of just someone who was very cold and dark. Detectives asked him where he was on the day of the murder. He stated he was in Bradenton with his wife. The investigators knew it was a lie. They had very clear footage of the car, of its license plate, of a person who fits the description of Christopher Dominic. Detectives started to press Christopher, asking questions about his cell phone number. At that point, he stops talking. He just stopped answering any other questions and he wanted to leave. It certainly looked suspicious, especially when coupled with the evidence that the police already had. They knew that Christopher Dominic was a convicted killer. They knew he had placed a call to Carlos shortly before the murder, and they could put him traveling to and from the scene of the crime. Police are starting to get pieces coming together and starting to realize that they have a very strong suspect. However, despite all the circumstantial evidence pointing to Christopher, the police still couldn't quite prove that he had killed Carlos. So at that point, he was free to go. While they suspected he had killed Carlos, the investigators still had no idea why Christopher would want Carlos dead. By the morning of October 4th, 2012, it had been less than 25 hours since Karen Donati's husband Carlos had been murdered while driving his cab in Sarasota, Florida. Carlos and Christopher seemed like 2 guys on 2 different sides of the tracks. Hoping to uncover how the 2 men were connected, the investigators contacted the Florida State Prison System. They combed through the records that they keep, visitor logs, and telephone logs. They discovered telephone conversations between Christopher Dominic and Karen Donati. 60-year-old Karen Donati was Carlos's wife of more than 10 years. The phone records revealed that she had known Christopher Dominic for at least that long. There was a large amount of phone activity between Christopher Dominic and Karen Donati while he was incarcerated. There were hundreds of phone calls, more than 900 in the last 11 months of Christopher's sentence. That's 2 to 3 calls per day that Christopher and Karen were making to each other. And it wasn't just phone calls either. Visitors' records show that Karen had come to see Christopher Dominic while he was incarcerated. There were numerous visits from Karen. Since Carlos's wife was the connection to Christopher Dominic, the next question the investigators needed to answer was, how did Karen know the ex-con? There was definitely a relationship there, and it was a long relationship. It was Christopher Dominic's friend, Lorraine Clark, the woman who had put the investigators onto him in the first place, who revealed just how long Karen had known him. They had known each other long before this murder happened. They had started out as neighbors, but had quickly become much more. Christopher is a very charismatic guy. He's a handsome guy. He's a funny guy. And he had been Karen's first love. Christopher and Karen had a relationship, physical relationship. There were a lot of drugs involved. They were very much in love. But in 1977, the couple's intense and tumultuous love affair had come to an abrupt end. He was convicted on 2 homicides, and he did about 30 years in jail for those. While Christopher was in jail, Karen had lost touch. She moved. She had this whole other life, a full life with children and grandchildren, culminating her decade-long marriage to Carlos Donati. But in 2002, shortly after she met Carlos, Christopher was suddenly back in Karen's life. While Christopher was incarcerated, Karen had gone to this fair where they allow inmates and visitors to interact. And Karen was invited by a friend of hers who was visiting her own family member. And Karen accompanied her to this fair where she happened to run into Christopher Dominic. And then they started writing letters back and forth to each other. Based on the prison logs, the letters, phone calls, and visits had continued and intensified for the next 10 years, despite the fact that Karen was married to Carlos. Christopher and Karen at one point were talking daily. What did that relationship have to do with Carlos's murder? His family believed they knew. They told the investigators that at the beginning of the marriage, Carlos and Karen had gotten along well. They seemed very happy, and she seemed happy too. But in the last few years of their decade-long marriage, the family had noticed a change. She was falling out of love with Carlos. Carlos' family thought Karen might be seeing someone else. They noticed a change in her. She dressed differently, her hair, her clothes, and always going somewhere on the weekend. According to Karen, she was visiting her daughter, but Carlos' family was not so sure. They think she had someone on the side. Carlos was growing suspicious too. He said to his family that there's something not right with her. But the family said that Carlos was determined to stick things out. He loved her, wanted to make his marriage work. And that became increasingly difficult as time went on. Karen would be mean to Carlos. She would talk down to him. She got to the point where every time he would say something, she would yell at him. Carlos' family asked him why he kept taking the abuse. He said that he wanted to make the marriage work. It was obvious to his family that Karen didn't want the marriage to work. They had urged him to leave Karen less than a week before his murder. He refused to leave. Carlos' mother said, "That bleep killed my son." Based on what they had learned about her marriage and her connection to Christopher Dominic, the investigators brought Karen in for questioning on the afternoon of October 4th. Detectives asked her if she had known a Christopher Dominic. She denied knowing him. Investigators knew that was false. The fact that she had lied about knowing Christopher was just as telling. Investigators knew they were on the right track. While the investigators are questioning Karen, a search warrant for the apartment she shared with Carlos is being executed. They discovered a box that contained hundreds of letters of correspondence between Karen and Christopher, love letters that she had kept when Christopher Dominic was in prison. He was sending her love letters almost daily. The plot thickens. Once investigators see what was written in those letters, they realize now they had a motive. The investigators searching the apartment immediately passed on what they had found to their counterparts in the interrogation room who turned up the heat on Karen. They started to bring out the proof that they had, that Karen had made phone calls to Christopher Dominic and Christopher Dominic had made phone calls to Karen. Once she realized just how much the police already knew, Karen's story began to change. Karen started to tell them what had happened. She started out by admitting that she did know Christopher Dominic. She told them that she was involved in an affair with him. She would leave saying she was going to visit her daughter when she wasn't. She was going to meet Christopher Dominic. According to Karen, during those meetups, eventually they began talking about ways to get Carlos out of the picture. She decided that she needed to come clean and She admitted she had conspired with Christopher Dominic to kill her husband. She did admit that she and Christopher had been planning this for quite a while. Although, according to Karen, it was Christopher's idea, one that she had gotten swept up in foolishly. Obsessed with the prospect of being reunited with her first love, it seems the guilt was weighing on her. She couldn't handle it anymore. The Sarasota police placed her under arrest for Carlos's murder. She had provided all the information that Dominic needed to pull this off. Thanks to Karen's confession, the investigators also felt they had enough to charge Christopher Dominic with murder. He was taken into custody in Bradenton. When Christopher Dominic was arrested, he had no reaction. Didn't even ask why. After all, Christopher was a convicted killer. But in the weeks ahead, some people will be wondering, was he also a pawn? By April 9, 2014, it had been a year and a half since Karen Donati's husband Carlos had been murdered while driving his taxicab in Sarasota, Florida. Everyone had nothing but good things to say about Carlos. Carlos was a very well-known local cab driver. Karen and a 62-year-old ex-con named Christopher Dominic had both been charged with a murder. That was her boyfriend. They had corresponded while he was in prison. At the time of her arrest in October of 2012, Karen had confessed to her role in the crime. She had been charged with second-degree murder for her role in the crime. She had come to court to testify against her old flame, Christopher Dominic, who was on trial for his alleged role in Carlos's murder. Christopher was just adamant that he did not commit this crime and that he was being charged based on the fact that he had a bad prior record, and he was adamant that he was being railroaded. But did Karen's old boyfriend have a point? After all, while they had considerable circumstantial evidence against him, the only thing directly connecting him to Carlos's murder was Karen's confession. Prosecutors had done everything in their power to secure her testimony against Christopher. The Sarasota District Attorney's Office offered her a plea deal in exchange for her testimony against Christopher. That's a decision that was made to get the actual shooter, the trigger man. He definitely needed to be in jail for life. So that was the goal. And it was no surprise that Karen had accepted the DA's offer. Karen's primary motive was to lessen her responsibility in this case by pointing the finger at Christopher Dominic. When Karen took the stand, the entire case was riding on her testimony. There was no firearm recovered. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual crime. There was no DNA evidence or any other forensic evidence. There was no hard evidence against Christopher Dominic whatsoever. The only thing linking Christopher Dominic to this crime is the testimony of Karen Donati. On the stand, Karen began by explaining the background, how throughout her marriage to Carlos, she and Christopher had been having a secret affair. She had romantic involvement with Christopher Dominic, despite the fact that they were separated by prison bars. And if the letters he had sent her from prison were any indication, their romance had been pretty steamy too. She saved all of the letters. Every single one of them was recovered from her apartment. The letters show that it was a very sexually explicit relationship. And if the hundreds of letters Christopher had sent her weren't enough to prove just how devoted he was to Karen, the prosecutors also played tapes of the prison phone calls between the lovers. There were a number of calls that the DA's office played. Some of them highlighted a lot of erotic talk and discussions of having sex. And Karen said that once Christopher was released from prison, the lovers had turned years of talk into reality, despite the fact that they were both married. When Christopher was released, he and Karen immediately met up. The affair continued for the next 11 months. She was visiting him. They would get together. However, Karen claimed that the affair wasn't the only motive behind Carlos's murder. They were in the plot to kill him for life insurance money. At the time of his death, Carlos had 2 insurance policies totaling $100,000. Their goal was to get rid of Carlos and collect on that life insurance policy. One of those policies had been taken out barely a year before Carlos' murder. Shortly before the murder, the amount was increased. Karen said that Christopher was the one who pushed her to increase the coverage, and the prosecutors had the audio tape to prove it. They had quite a few discussions about that policy, discussions that were recorded on tape when Chris Dominic was in prison. There is a conversation that takes place in which Christopher tells Karen, in so many words, you need to up his, meaning Carlos's insurance policy. And in response, a few days later, Karen calls Christopher and tells him, look, I did what you asked me to. I changed the insurance policy. Carlos' family was shocked when they hear about these things in court. They had no idea they were going on. What she was doing behind Carlos' back. Although, as both Karen and the prosecutor stressed, She only did it because Christopher told her to. She would do anything for Christopher. But as Karen told the jury, once Carlos was dead, she immediately regretted what she had done. She kept saying that she was sorry. But was it the truth? Not according to Christopher's defense attorney. They say she should not be believed because she is testifying against Christopher to reduce her jail time. When Christopher's defense presented their case, the scenario they laid out was the exact opposite of what Karen claimed. Almost all of it came from Karen. It was Karen who was going to change these policies. And Christopher sort of just went along with it. And since Karen's testimony was the only thing that directly connected Christopher to the crime, the defense maintained that he was completely innocent. Christopher was just adamant that he did not commit this crime. And they reminded the jury that the prosecutors had no murder weapon and no evidence to actually put him in Carlos' car. They were circumstantial. It could have been anyone who drove that phone and threw it out. And the call from his phone that pointed to him in the first place, the defense claimed that Christopher wasn't the one who made that call. He had given that phone to Karen Donati before the day of the homicide. Karen had actually provided Christopher with that phone so they can talk privately anytime. But why would Christopher give Karen back the phone that served as their secret hotline? Christopher had in fact ended the relationship with Karen. And Karen was very upset with the fact that Christopher no longer wanted to be with her. That was not acceptable to Karen. She continued to pursue Christopher even after the fact. And according to the defense, it was Karen who had killed Carlos. Christopher Dominic put everything on her that she shot him. The defense claimed that Karen had not only murdered Carlos, they said that she was obsessed with Christopher Dominic, and she had intentionally dumped her dead husband's phone on the way to Christopher's house to frame her ex-boyfriend for the murder. On April 17, 2014, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the murder trial of Karen Donati's ex-boyfriend, Christopher Dominic. They deliberated for almost a day. The 62-year-old ex-con was accused of killing Karen's husband, Carlos. She and Christopher planned this together. At least that's what Karen had testified in court as part of her plea deal. The DA's office offered her a fixed amount of time in jail, and in return for that, she would have to testify against Christopher. Christopher's defense, on the other hand, argued that Karen was Carlos's killer. They both were blaming each other. According to the defense, Karen had set up Christopher to take the fall for a crime after Christopher put an end to their affair. In the end, the case came down to who the jury believed, Karen or Christopher. There's a lot of tension in the courtroom. Christopher knew what the stakes were. He knew that he was looking at a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The jury found Christopher Dominic guilty of murder. Christopher was very upset at the verdict. He was going to prison for life. What about Karen? She was technically serving life too. But the terms of her plea deal meant that parole was an option. She was sentenced to 15 years to life. The thought that Karen could get out in as little as 15 years leaves Carlos's family disappointed. They want her to be in prison for the rest of her life. The family is determined to see that she stays there. When she goes before the parole board, the family will be there to say she deserves to stay longer. The level of premeditation involved is striking. To have plans in place for so long demonstrates a deep commitment to that course of action. The deliberate intent is obvious. Carlos' family said that she is just as guilty as the man who pulled the trigger. There's plenty of opportunity for them to stop, to say this is wrong. We can't do this. But they did not. They kept going. They executed these plans, and they executed Carlos Donati. That's pure evil. Despite her guilty plea, Karen Donati appealed her second-degree murder conviction. In 2016, her appeal was denied. She will be eligible for parole in 2027 at the age of 75. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Tom's True Crime. If you are interested in more in-depth investigations into the most perplexing crimes, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. What are your thoughts about this case? Please share them with us in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe.